Professor Steve Chapman, Principal and Vice Chancellor of this excellent university, members of the faculty, representatives of industry, friends, ladies and gentlemen. I'm truly privileged to be here, and Professor Chapman has told you that he has been inducted as a terrier, but he didn't lose a single minute to make me a Heriot-Watter, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and may I also compliment the leadership of this remarkable institution, which I learned has a long history, for having organized this interactive session with industry. Because I think the answers and solutions to the problems we face in the field of climate change, like so many other global challenges, obviously lies in mobilizing the very best across all stakeholder groups. And industry has to be an important part of the solution. I'm going to make a PowerPoint presentation, and at the advice of the Vice Chancellor and based on my own instincts, I would like to go through my presentation as quickly as possible so that there's enough time for discussion and questions and answers, because I think that's always, to me at least, the most beneficial part of what a session like this really provides. Okay, let me first look at observed changes in some key parameters relating to the climate represent throughout the period that the world has industrialized. And may I say it's a great privilege to be in an institution which essentially was named after the person who was responsible for the Industrial Revolution. I think if James Watt hadn't come along, we probably wouldn't have had industrialization the way we have experienced it. Because essentially it was through his invention that we were able to substitute muscle power. And this led not only to locomotion and transportation as it has evolved over a period of time, but the very production of goods and services in factories would just not have been possible if the steam engine hadn't been invented. So I feel overawed at being in a place where you could say the Industrial Revolution really began. So if you look at the first picture on the top over here, you would see that global average temperature has increased over a period of time, and certainly there are fluctuations in this value as you look at it over a period of time. What's particularly significant is that in the last 50 years, the trend has been distinctly upwards. And that's essentially because of the human influence on the Earth's climate. We have said in the fourth assessment report of the IPCC that most of the warming that has taken place since the middle of the last century is very likely on account of increase in the concentration of anthropogenic concentration of greenhouse gases. And when we use the term very likely, we are assigning a probability of over 90%. So you can see that over there in the trend in the last 50 odd years. Sea level rise has also taken place during the same period, both on account of thermal expansion of the oceans as well as melting of the bodies of ice across the globe. And if you look at the temperature increase during the 20th century, it was about 0.74 degrees Celsius on average, and sea level rise was about 17 centimeters. And that also corresponds to the decline in northern hemisphere snow cover, which you can see in the third picture over here. Now, projected surface temperature changes, the IPCC has come up with estimates of these projections by the end of the century, and they range from 1.1 degrees Celsius to 6.4 degrees Celsius. And of course, this range is clearly linked with the kinds of variations that we may have in economic growth, in the use of technologies, and a whole range of variables that essentially would determine the extent of increase in concentration of greenhouse gases and the associated associated changes in temperature. Now, to be able to focus on two sets of values, which perhaps would help us in understanding what needs to be done, we came up with a best estimate at the lower end, which is 1.8 degrees Celsius, and at the upper end, 4 degrees Celsius. Now, even at the lower end best estimate, 1.8 degrees Celsius, the world would experience a total warming in the 20th and the 21st century of over 2.5%. So even the lower end best estimate is clearly something that, according to what the world has agreed on under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, needs to be prevented. Since 1950, extreme hot days and heavy precipitation events have become more common, and we have produced a special report in the IPCC on extreme events and disasters, which clearly shows that these are on the increase, and anthropogenic influences, including increasing atmospheric greenhouse gas concentration, have changed these extremes. So these extremes are going to increase, both in intensity and frequency, and I'll say a little more about it. And impacts of climate extremes can be felt locally or regionally. I'm not for a moment suggesting that these headlines that you have over here are related to human-induced climate change, but I am asserting the fact that these will become much more commonplace if we allow climate change to proceed unmitigated. Mongolian herdsmen face starvation, and I've been to Mongolia. I've seen the kind of evidence, the anecdotes that one was subjected to, that one was exposed to over there. Heat wave hits French power production. You remember 2003, there was a huge heat wave in Paris and around that area, which obviously had major impact. Drought returns to haunt Ethiopia. Cholera confirmed in Pakistan flood disaster. And this disaster was really extensive. And whenever floods break out in any part of the world, the biggest challenge is to prevent disease. Because in the wake of floods, diseases become widespread. Alpine resorts feel heat during record warm spells. Flash flooding causes train to derail. Now, all of these really imply in very clear terms that industry has to be concerned about these impacts. Industry cannot remain insulated and isolated from some of these impacts because they will affect economic activities. Let me give you a more recent example, Superstorm Sandy, which hit the northeast part of the US, estimated to have damaged or reduced GDP by about $52 billion. Now, that's a huge loss. So there is clearly an economic link between the impacts of climate change and what industry can possibly do under those circumstances. If we look at the causes of climate change, of course, there are global greenhouse gas emissions, which have grown 70% between 1970 and 2004. And CO2 emissions have actually grown faster at about 80% during the same period. And I've already mentioned the statement that you have at the bottom of this slide, which is very significant. The industrial sector, quite apart from being affected by the impacts of climate change, is also, to a significant extent, responsible for these emissions. For instance, if you look at energy-related CO2 emissions from the industrial sector, they grew from 6 gigatons of CO2 in 1971 to 9.9 gigatons in 2004. And if you look at the sources of these emissions, 35% came from the developed nations, 11% from transition economies, and 53% from the developing nations. Now, of course, in the economies in transition, as you know, there was an economic decline as a result of which emissions actually went down. So this could be a kind of a temporary phase which doesn't in any way indicate what the future might. The future might see a greater increase in emissions than we have witnessed in the past. There are impacts of climate change, some which could be abrupt and irreversible, like a loss of the ice sheets, for instance, in Greenland or West Antarctica, could result in sea level rise of several meters. We've also assessed that 20 to 30% of the species that we looked at are at the risk of extinction if increases in warming exceed 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. We also know that there is a weakening of the meridional overturning circulation, and this has major impacts on marine ecosystem productivity, fisheries, ocean CO2 uptake, and of course terrestrial vegetation. So there is the possibility of some major changes in the climate, in the geography, and the conditions that make life possible on this planet. There are projected impacts on livelihoods. The impacts of climate change could result in low economic growth, lack of skilled labor, lack of industry. Then we also know that those areas where agriculture is the primary source of subsistence, they would be affected. Communities could therefore face malnutrition, and we know that there is a lot of malnutrition and hunger in several parts of the world. Now that could get exacerbated on account of the impacts of climate change. We also know that low literacy rates are endemic in several parts of the world, and these of course could be affected on account of the impacts of climate change. There's a whole range of other issues that characterizes conditions in several parts of the world. These could also be exacerbated, like the shortage of safe drinking water. So, in other words, there would be impacts on climate change which certainly affect livelihoods and economic activities in several parts of the world. Now, I don't expect you to read this, but this is just to tell you that the IPCC has used a range of climate models by which we can come up with an estimation of how heat waves will increase over a period of time. The important point is what is mentioned right at the bottom. In many regions, the time between 20-year warm days will decrease. In fact, we have estimated that those heat waves which take place once in 20 years in many parts of the world will occur once in 2 years by the end of this century. So that's a substantial increase that we have to be prepared for, which means that the world has to do both mitigate as well as adapt to some of these impacts. Increasing vulnerability, exposure, or severity and frequency of climate events increases disaster risk. I just want to give you an example. In 2008, in Burma, which is now known as Myanmar, there was a terrible cyclone called Cyclone Nargis, which hit a part of that country, and something like 140,000 lives were lost. Now that's essentially because there was no early warning system. The kinds of buildings or structures that people live in are extremely flimsy, and there's absolutely no place to go for relief, and therefore there's massive loss of life and property. So these are occurrences that clearly point to much greater vulnerability to these disasters in several parts of the world. Vulnerability of industry to climate change can be identified as, particularly if we look at extreme weather, in order to adapt to these, companies will have to take in hand some adaptation measures. And let me mention something that's not mentioned over here. I mean, if you have health impacts as a result of climate change, then clearly this could lead to higher absenteeism, lower levels of productivity, and this may arise on account of a whole range of health-related impacts of climate change. But what we need to do is to design resistant facilities. In some cases, we may need to relocate plants to less vulnerable locations, diversify raw material sources, especially agricultural or forestry inputs. If you were to identify companies that are concerned about their supply chain then you could take companies like, and I've talked to the leadership of several of these companies like Nestle, Unilever, and many others which are dependent on supply of raw materials, which would be very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So obviously, industry will have to take measures by which it sort of minimizes the risk of damage to its own financial and economic success in the future. Industry can also ensure that it practices what it often preaches. In other words, you have to mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases because there would be reputational benefits. And conversely, there could be reputational harm if an industry doesn't do what society expects it to do. So one needs to ensure that industry mitigates its own emissions and develops lower emission products, because you'll find gradually that the public will demand and place a higher premium on low emission products over a period of time. This is just an example of the Pakistan floods which took place in 2010. And in fact, I remember overflying Pakistan on that occasion. It was a very clear day after the rains and after the floods had more or less subsided, but I just couldn't believe my eyes. I've never seen such a vast area of land completely underwater, and this was absolutely devastating. And these floods came back in 2011 as well. And as it happens, we have found that fatalities from natural disaster-related events, from all kinds of natural disasters, not just climate-related, has been about 95% in the developing countries. So that clearly shows that there's a much higher level of vulnerability and possibly also much more severe impacts of climate change in the developing countries. So this will obviously affect economic activities globally because we are living in a globalized world now. And effective risk management and adaptation are tailored to local and regional needs and circumstances. And here, let me state something that I think is common across the globe. Mitigation has to be a global effort because you're dealing with gases that mix freely, and therefore, to reduce gases in one place doesn't necessarily have a global impact immediately unless it's accompanied by a global effort to reduce emissions everywhere. But when it comes to adaptation, that's essentially centered on local initiative. And this is something that we need to keep in mind because each region has unique vulnerabilities and exposure to hazards, and effective risk management and adaptation address the factors contributing to exposure and vulnerability. So we need to create local governance, local capacity, and devise local solutions by which we can adapt to the impacts of climate change. And I should also mention that there is a certain inertia in the system as a result of which the increase in emissions and concentrations that has taken place historically will lead to climate change over several decades, even if we were to freeze our emission levels at where they are today. So because of the inertia in the system, the impacts of climate change will continue quite a bit into the future. There are, of course, roles and there are, of course, limits to adaptation. Societies across the globe have a history of being able to adapt to climatic changes. And adaptation is, of course, necessary to address impacts resulting from the warming, which is already unavoidable. And adaptation to the impacts of climate change and promotion of sustainable development share common goals. Sustainable development, as you know, is development which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So therefore, if you can adapt to the impacts of climate change, you're also serving the objectives of sustainable development. And often the actions required are similar and coincidental. But adaptation alone is not expected to cope with all the projected effects of climate change. We need to do much more. So what we said clearly was neither adaptation nor mitigation alone can avoid all climate change impacts. However, they can complement each other and together can significantly reduce the risks of climate change. So we need to do both, mitigation at the global level, adaptation at the local level in different parts of the world. This is just to show you what would be required. Let's say if we want to stabilize, and you can look at the first row over here, if we want to stabilize temperature increase to about 2 to 2.4 degrees Celsius, which is what the global community has set as an aspirational target, then CO2 emissions would need to peak no later than 2015. That's not far away. It's tomorrow. And do we have confidence that the world is going to do that? To be quite honest, it doesn't seem at all possible. And this doesn't mean that we cannot stabilize temperature increase to this level subsequently, but the costs will be substantially higher, and so would the impacts. So I think we have to decide, as part of a risk management strategy, which every industry does, every business enterprise does, whether we need to take action today, which would be far safer, far lower in terms of risk, and much less expensive, or should we wait to take these steps subsequently? Now that's a decision that the world has to take. And it's really not correct to say that mitigation is going to cost a lot. In fact, we have estimated that if we were to carry out stringent mitigation, then the implications in the year 2030 would be that about less than 3% of the global GDP would need to be incurred to pursue this path of mitigation. And that amounts to about 0.12% of the GDP each year. And if you look at the year 2030, what this implies is that the level of prosperity that the world would reach in 2030 would at best be postponed by a few months or a year. And that, to my mind, is not a very heavy price to pay for avoiding some of the worst impacts of climate change and being able to mitigate at the least possible cost. Okay, now managing the risks, we really need to identify risk factors. Population growth is certainly one of them. If you have a heavily populated city, like some of the mega deltas in Asia, that includes Shanghai, Dhaka, Kolkata, then clearly the concentration of population makes these places very high risk areas. Increasing property value, the more expensive the property, obviously the greater the risk of loss. Higher storm surge with sea level rise, and storm surges can really cause major havoc. I can tell you in 1997, when I was elected as vice chair of the IPCC, our plenary session of the panel took place in the Maldives. And the then president of Maldives, President Gayoom, addressed us and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the place where you're holding your meeting today, 8 years ago or 9 years ago, was under about 1.5 feet of water." So really speaking, you don't have to wait for the Maldive Islands to be completely inundated and submerged. I think the impacts of climate change will be felt far before that, because even if the average increase in sea level has been 17 centimeters, that's bad enough for storm surges and such events to really affect some of these areas adversely. What can we do for adaptation? Better forecasting, early warning systems, stricter building codes, regional risk pooling. So I think we have to come together and make sure that we set in place measures by which we can minimize risk. If you look at this particular incident which took place, risk factors were rapid growth of informal settlements, which shouldn't have been in that particular area. Weak building construction, so even the slightest weather event would wipe out these structures. Settlements built near rivers and blocked drainage areas. Adaptation, reduced poverty, and of course, poverty is one major contributor to the risk that's associated with these events. Strengthen the buildings, improve drainage and sewage, early warning systems. And this morning at breakfast, we were having a discussion on the moral arguments to see that we start doing something about climate change. And I think this is a very good example of communities which have not contributed as the sources of the problem of the emissions that have contributed to climate change, but are clearly the victims of what perhaps has been done by the rest of the world. So there is a moral argument in taking action on climate change, which of course doesn't get highlighted often enough. Challenges for the industrial sector, well, in developing countries, we do have new technology with low energy use, and I think we should make the most of these opportunities. There is a huge demand for technology transfer to improve energy efficiency and reduce emissions. But more important than that, I think there is a clear rationale for joint technology development, because a lot of these technologies also need to be customized for local application. And that doesn't happen all that often. But I think it has enormous merit. And I would submit that an institution like this, which is so well known in the fields of science and technology, could possibly go in a big way towards collaborative research, collaborative innovation with institutions in the developing world. And many older, inefficient facilities remain in industrialized and developing countries. So I think both the public and the private sectors have important roles to play in the development of low greenhouse gas emission technologies to carry out mitigation. Now, many options exist for mitigating GHGs in the industrial sector, and I don't need to list all these out, but let me emphasize the fact that there are huge co-benefits from some of these measures. And these include lower levels of pollution at the local level. That means health benefits for those who would be affected, much higher levels of energy security, and often much greater employment. I'm very impressed to learn that Scotland is really at the forefront of ambitious actions to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. And I think examples like this can be an inspiration for the rest of the world. So I'm delighted to be here and learn about what Scotland is trying to do. Because given the fact that we don't have a global agreement, and yesterday I want to mention I also had a brief meeting with President Hollande of France, and clearly France is quite concerned about climate change. They're going to host, hopefully, the Conference of the Parties in 2015. But it's obvious that you need action at the local level to create a momentum across the globe by which hopefully we will get an agreement at the global level. Mitigation potential and costs in the industrial sector, well, located in the steel, cement, plant, and paper industries are lots of opportunities for control of non-CO2 gases. Application of carbon capture and storage technology offers large additional potential, but of course at higher cost. So, there's no dearth of opportunities which industry, possibly in collaboration with research and academia, can develop and implement over a period of time. What are the uncertainties in mitigation potential and the cost in 2030? Well, the rate of technology development and diffusion is still a bit uncertain. The cost of future technology, nobody knows, but if you look at the history of industrial evolution, clearly people have made investments, taken certain risks in the hope that technology that develops will give them very large returns. So there's a strong case for pursuing a much more aggressive approach in that area. Future energy and carbon prices are unknown. I can tell you, I got into environmental issues and then into climate change by first studying energy policy. And way back in 1985, I brought out a book called The Political Economy of Global Energy, where I essentially assessed the global oil market in considerable detail and depth. And I projected that oil prices will increase in the future. And the book came out in 85, and oil prices actually crashed. Now, you can imagine the sales of my book went in the same direction. So, I mean, that's a hazardous business. You really can't predict future energy and carbon prices. And I'll never do that throughout my life, I can assure you. Once bitten, twice shy. The level of industrial activity in 2030, one knows very little about where it will happen, what levels of activity we'll have, and what would be the sort of business opportunities. And then, of course, we don't know about climate and non-climate policy drivers. I mentioned non-climate policy drivers, such as local pollution, health benefits associated with them, and so on and so forth. So, you know, there are some uncertainties, but business and industry is used to taking decisions in an atmosphere of uncertainty. So there's no reason why, with the existing uncertainties, business and industry cannot take the lead. I mean, industrialization has grown essentially on the strength of these decisions under uncertainty. Full use of available mitigation options is not being made in industrialized and developing countries. There are clearly some tardy indications which need to be taken into account, and there are plenty of barriers that I don't have to go into. Industry knows what these barriers are, but you really need an unprecedented level of coordination and cooperation between government and industry so that you have a clear roadmap, you have some perception of policy stability for a reasonable period of time, because only that would induce investments and efforts. Okay, so committing to alternative development paths would require structural changes, and this means we have to make some new institutional changes. We're also dealing with geographical distribution of activities. These are changing, demography is changing, and lifestyles and consumption patterns will also change undoubtedly over a period of time. So now the question really is whether we want to take action today or wait till we get overwhelmed by several developments that would force us into taking action. And here, may I quote Gandhi, who incidentally was a great admirer of Scotland. He said, a technological society has two choices. First, it can wait until catastrophic failures expose systemic deficiencies, distortion, and self-deceptions. Secondly, a culture can provide social checks and balances to correct for systemic distortion prior to catastrophic failures. And here, let me end with a final thought before I request the video to be shown. What is critically important is for business and industry to focus on the changes that are taking place globally in markets that are evolving. C.K. Prahalad, the great management guru, wrote about the bottom of the pyramid. And the bottom of the pyramid consists of several billion people in the developing world who are now coming into the market system. And therefore, they provide a unique opportunity by which technological solutions and market initiatives can change their lives and also provide opportunities for business and industry. And I want to give you one example of that through a very brief video that I'd like to now request be screened. May I say that through this campaign which we have launched, we have covered about 2,000 villages in India and several others in Africa and other parts of the world. And there are just 2 points I'd like to make. Firstly, it's important for us to visualize how science and technology can change the lives of those who are completely deprived at this point of time. And one doesn't have to do this by pursuing the conventional path that was established in the developed countries. There are unique opportunities by which we can deviate from that path and that pattern. And that's something where you have enormous business opportunities. And here, may I also mention that while these 2,000 villages have been done by my institute, the private sector has seen the benefits of this, and in a sense, we have literally lit the way, and they have gone for business opportunities on a much larger scale. So there is today this unique opportunity for businesses, industries located in the developed world to join hands with those in the developing world and look at market opportunities that so far have remained untapped through examples of the type that I've tried to project over here. Thank you very much.